parles-tu, Reflections on Truth, Power and the Open Society. That's not the way the world works anymore. We're an empire now, and when we act, we create our own reality. And while you, journalists, are studying that reality, we'll act again, creating other new realities, and you, all of you, will be left just to study what we do. Thus, an advisor to George W. Bush castigating the journalist Ron Suskind for attempting to report on what he took to be a discernible reality out there and open to objective scrutiny. But as he had just been told, the world is not like that anymore. It would be hard to find a more succinct statement of what has come to be known as a post-truth position in a post-truth world. Crudely expressed as it is, what it amounts to is the claim that there is no truth or reality out there. Truth and reality, or better, in inverted commas, truth and reality in inverted commas, are things we, that is, those in power, construct. And what the Bush advisor is saying is that the rest of us just have to march to their tune, which simply invites the rejoinder from those who don't like this. All right then, we will construct our reality and use what power we have to confront and contest yours. The example I've just quoted is from a right-wing source, but the attitude to truth is by no means confined to the political right. If anything, attitudes of this sort are more deeply embedded in left-wing thinking, where the implications of such views are more fully argued and elaborated. For many so-called postmodernist thinkers, particularly when dealing with matters of history, politics, and so on, not only is there no such thing as the truth, but any view that is expressed is to be seen as no more than the vehicle of some interest, class, race, gender, or whatever. The question of the source of an opinion or a fact, in inverted commas, du parles-tu, becomes far more important than its truth or validity, because there is no such thing as truth or validity. Truth and validity are simply words we use to enhance the standing of what we construct. It cannot be too strongly emphasized or too often repeated that, philosophically speaking, talk of constructing truth and knowledge is not just barbaric English, it is nonsensical. You can only actually know what is true, and what is true because it actually is the case, independently of what anyone thinks or believes. Beliefs and thoughts are, in a certain sense, constructed psychological entities in our minds and underpinning our actions. With luck and experience and work, and also thanks to our biology and upbringing, many of our beliefs and thoughts are true and amount to knowledge in the sense that we have good grounds for holding these truths. Some of what we think we know, though, we do not know, as for example, Newton did not know that space and time were absolute, although he had plenty of reasons for thinking that, and for 200 years or so, all or most good scientists followed him in this erroneous belief, which should make us cautious in claiming to know. Knowledge transcends what we construct. It is not in our gift. None of which stops those in charge of educating our children from asserting that children and adults, and this is a quotation from a very widely used textbook in education, children construct or build their own knowledge rather than having it given or delivered to them, to quote from one of the most widely used texts in teacher training. The rot in this area starts early. Nor is there anything new in this rot, in undermining or deconstructing foundational concepts that are normally and properly taken to refer to reality in a substantial way. In Book 1 of Plato's Republic, the sophist Thrasymachus famously announced that justice is what serves the interests of the stronger. We might say in reply that in any particular society, what is called justice may reflect the status quo and the interests of the rich and the powerful, but that there is, nevertheless, an absolute standard, true justice, against which particular acts and institutions and societies are to be judged, as indeed Plato judged his own society when he advocated female equality among the rulers. But that would not move Thrasymachus. He knew what Thucydides knew, that particularly in times of struggle and strife, key words, those like justice and truth, which refer to basic values, are slippery. The way people use them changes. There are Orwellian shifts in their meaning. Writing of the civil war in Corcyra, that's Corfu, what we call Corfu, in 427 BC, Thucydides says this: "To fit in with the change of events, words too had to change their normal meanings. What used to be described as a thoughtless act of aggression was now regarded as the courage one would expect of a party member. To think of the future and wait was merely another way of saying that one was a coward. Any idea of moderation was just an attempt to disguise one's unmanly character. Ability to understand a question from all sides meant one was wholly unfitted for action. If an opponent made a reasonable speech, the party in power, so far from giving it a generous reception, took every precaution to see it had no practical effect." History of the Peloponnesian War, Book 3, Section 82. And he adds that love of power, operating through greed and personal ambition, was the cause of all these evils, which indeed it was, and still is today, when we see similar linguistic deformations. Power and self-interest, or the interest of one's party, distort what is said, and even the use of meaning of words. But what if there is no truth or justice, absolutely speaking, but only what particular people call truth and justice to further their own ends or parties? Then there is nothing left in discussing an opinion or a fact, in inverted commas, but to ask where it comes from, whose interest it is serving. Du parles-tu. This is precisely what, over 2 millennia after Thucydides, we find in Nietzsche. Truth is a mobile army of metaphors, metonyms, anthropomorphisms, in short, a sum of human relations which have been subjected to poetic and rhetorical intensifications. Truths are illusions, of which we have forgotten they are illusions. A famous passage from an early work, and though contested, highly popular in postmodernist circles today. But in a way, even more striking, this time from the genealogy of morals at the end of Nietzsche's life, we have this, or the end of his career, actually. The end of his life was 10 years of insanity. Pale atheists, antichrists, immoralists, these skeptics, that is, people who might have expected support from Nietzsche, he says, these skeptics cannot see that this ideal is simply their ideal as well. And he goes on to say that they are far from being free spirits, for they still have faith in truth. Freedom of spirit means, according to Nietzsche, nothing is true, everything is permitted, and that we must call into question the value of truth. In other words, if truth is an illusion, then all we can do is to ask where an opinion is coming from. Du parles-tu, not is what you say true. Of course, there is in Nietzsche the same illusion between what people say is true and what is actually true, which we saw in Thrasymachus, on justice. Nor does Nietzsche appear to ask himself what credence we should give to his views. If there is no truth, they are not true. Why then should we accept them coming from that somewhat self-dramatizing source? It is just this aspect of Nietzsche's thinking, though, along with its inherent confusions, that has been gaily adopted by postmodernists such as Foucault, Derrida, Baudrillard, and Lyotard, who argue that in the face of the Nietzschean undermining of what they call narratives of legitimation of Enlightenment thinking, no truth in other words, we are obliged to adopt a stance of opposition to everything which appears to them to be a product of the power structures and institutions which those narratives upheld. Western culture, in other words. What, though, of the self-refuting nature of their own position? In Roger Scruton's words, the advocate of deconstruction cheerfully accepts the disproof of his own philosophy, for what matters to him is not the truth of an utterance, but the interest that is being advanced through it. Your criticism shows you to be a denizen of the traditional criticism, a parasitical resident in the house of Western culture. To think you can get rid of deconstruction by disproving it is to fail to recognize that proof itself has been deconstructed. Proof is what others do. It's them that we're against. Scruton is here expressing, somewhat ironically, what Richard Rorty argued perfectly seriously in the opening pages of Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity. Arguments about fundamental concepts like truth and reality, he says, are bound to be inconclusive and question-begging, because either side in such an argument will simply be using his or her own incommensurable concepts. To quote, interesting philosophy is usually a contest between an entrenched vocabulary which has become a nuisance and a half-formed new vocabulary which vaguely promises great things. So, in what he is about to write in his book, he says, I am not going to offer arguments against the vocabulary I want to replace. What he is going to do is to drop any notion of fitting the world in discussing knowledge or of intrinsic value in analysing political aims or the morality of desires, and simply seek a set of increasingly useful metaphors. But useful in whose interest, one might ask? And can it be true, as Rorty suggests, that there is no such thing as an intrinsically evil desire, and agreeing with President Bush's advisor that we make truths? We are back to Thrasymachus and Thucydides with a vengeance. No truth, no natural goodness, no valid arguments, no firm vocabulary or concepts in which to discuss such things, but only contests between rival interests and power groups, each sheltering behind their own redescriptions and shifting linguistic forms. In such a context, as Rorty has correctly told us, argument is futile. We are each going to mean different things by our words, depending on where we stand, and what the words describe are simply our own constructions with no objective validity. Moreover, each person's words are only a way of asserting his or her own power, or that of the group. In these circumstances, argument counts for nothing. What counts is what is hiding behind the words, the interest that is being promoted in each case. And allowing someone a voice is allowing their interest some weight, which is something that is not necessarily desirable. As long ago as 1974, Sartre wrote that in all the conflicts of our time, quote, class, national, racial, are particular effects of the oppression of the underprivileged. The true intellectual finds himself as a man conscious of his own oppression on the side of the oppressed. We can speculate as to why the true intellectual finds himself on the side of the oppressed. Heidegger and Nietzsche, two of the precursors of today's postmodernism, certainly didn't. But what we are now in a position to understand is why, for many of today's intellectuals, what matters is not the quality of an argument, for arguments have none, but, as would be said, where they are coming from and why. Consequently, some should not be heard if they are promoting the interests of the oppressors or those who are perceived to be oppressors. We need at this point to go back to the beginning. The whole postmodernist position, like that of Thrasymachus, rests on a failure to distinguish between what is true and what is believed to be true, and also on a failure to acknowledge that its inherent nihilism and consequent repudiation of argument and validity undermines its own acceptability. Far from speaking truth to power, postmodernists represent any attempt to search for the truth as simply a mask for the exercise of power. And where, as all too often, they deny the others the chance to speak, censoring what they want to say, their own position stands revealed, as simply an exercise of power. They would return us to the situation of the Corcyraeans in 427 BC, the outcome of which I'm sure I don't need to spell out. If, on the other hand, and unlike the Corcyraeans, we are prepared to accept the possibility of reasonable speech and to recognize it when it occurs, which is surely a fundamental aspect of an open society, we should also recognize that good ideas, and indeed truths, can come from any source. Let us begin by underlining the distinction between what is true and what is believed by us or others to be true. Bearing in mind the fate of Newtonian physics, and admitting that even the best of what we believe may not in fact be true, should, in Karl Popper's words in The Open Society and Its Enemies, lead not just to a humility on our own part, but also to the view that everybody with whom we communicate is a potential source of argument and of reasonableness. Refusing to respect reason, and in Popper's inimitable English, the other fellow's point of view, will produce an attitude which considers the person of the thinker instead of his thought. It must produce the belief that we think with our blood, or with our national heritage, or with our class. Considering the thought rather than who has the thought will, by contrast, establish what Popper calls the rational unity of mankind. The contrary will, as Popper emphasizes, lead to splitting mankind into friends and foes, with all the potential for censorship, repression, and worse, characteristic of closed societies. What Popper calls rationalism, that's basically admitting one's own fallibility, combined with a readiness to allow anyone who is not intolerant themselves a right to be heard and to defend his or her arguments, depends, as he also says, on the existence of social institutions to protect freedom of criticism, freedom of thought, and thus the freedom of men. That's a quotation again. Foremost among such institutions will be universities, which is why intolerance there is no small matter. It is something which is serious for the society in which they exist, as was shown all too vividly in post-1933 Germany. We live in paradoxical times. The internet and the social media allow anyone to express and publish a view on anything. In many ways, this is a good thing. But this freedom also generates great swathes of hostile and cruel messaging which make individuals afraid to express themselves. Universities should be places where individuals should be able to express their opinions, discuss and disagree without fear of censorship, mob hostility, or loss of job. To the extent that they allow censorship of views some find objectionable and tolerate violence in their suppression, as seems to be the case in 2019 in some cases, they are no better than the Corcyraeans described by Thucydides. But in considering this dismal scene, we should not overlook the way in which postmodernist thinking has contributed to it.